Okay, so welcome back everybody. Today we're talking about whether rent vesting in 2025 is still a good idea. I'm surrounded by my power team here. Michael O'Malley, mortgage manager from Rate Money Sydney CBD. Andrew Chan, strategic financial planner from Phoenix Private Wealth Management. George Coletti, principal accountant from Access Professionals. Daniela Musitano, founder and executive director of Title Space Conveyancing, and myself, Gianni Musumeci from Leverage Property Advisors. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, the content in this podcast is only general in nature and it does not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice, and it's strongly recommended that you seek professional advice that is specific to your situation before acting on anything. So that being said, I wanted to kick in two things. What are some of the considerations that people need to take into account when deciding whether to go owner-occupied and rent vesting route? I wanted to direct this question at you, Andrew. Coming from a financial planning perspective, what do I need to understand?
I mean, it's all about goals. I know you asked me specifically for rent vesting, but rent vesting is nothing new. It's just opportunity costs, right? So you're in a situation, you have money and you're looking to invest and you're looking to derive an income with that money, and I would step it back one step prior as a financial advisor, because there's opportunities. If you have the opportunity to start your business, you know, that's the opportunity to make more money. If you're going to make a success out of that, than maybe buying a property, right? And so, you know, your example, you could buy a property, and often in Australia, the dream is to have that white picket fence, and we all fall into that trap. But that means that that's a 30-year mortgage that we're in, and we slowly pay that down. Where the opportunity cost is, if you had the skills, you had the knowledge, you had the opportunity, you might have started a company instead, and you would have scaled that and bought many properties further down the track. Or if you don't have those skills, then you might rent vest, right? So you might be able to, instead of buying a home and it's yielding you, it's a $1 million home yielding you 3%, you might be able to buy 2 properties that are yielding you more. But, you know, there's a trade-off, right? So, you know, you might buy 2 properties and you might be in a situation like COVID where your tenants might not be able to pay you rent. And you'll be in a difficult situation where they're able to stay there, and you'll have to wait the prescribed periods before you can go to the ombudsman, and you might not get a favorable result. So there's a whole lot of risks that I'll outlay to the clients to say, are you up for this strategy? Are you able to rent vest? But the reality is it's just simply about cash flow. Rent vesting I've seen done poorly. I've seen it done really, really well. So rent vesting, you buy a property that's yielding higher, that has greater prospects. It's very important who you select, what buyers agents you engage like yourself, who will be able to find those necessary products with the right characteristics. The mortgage that you engage, Mike, you know, get a good rate from your mortgage. Make sure that there's no issues, Daniela, with the inspection. And know that these investment properties are going to yield you a higher amount of income that will not only pay for your rent, but you'll be able to rent something nicer and also put some money in your pocket. And that's what rent vesting is. If you're buying something that is not going to yield you as much and you're renting for more, then you're actually in a worse situation. And these are the numbers that we often need to do. And George, you will see that in their tax returns, to say that at the end of the day, why are we doing it? We're doing it because we're trying to invest and get more cash flow, right? And so if you're coming back with more negative cash flow, it does make sense. Negative cash flow is not the worst thing, because negative cash flow in terms of rent investing allows you to negative gear, and ding, 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 that's really exciting. But just remember, it's not, that's in the beginning stages. We don't always want a negative gear, because it's rather than lose 100 to get some tax back, we would rather get 100 and have a profit in the end. And often, if we are profitable, we can actually build our wealth much more quickly. And George, you could chime in if you agree or disagree.
Absolutely. No, I've got a couple of clients who are in that exact situation where their lifestyle choices are that they don't necessarily or aren't able to afford where they actually want to live. So what they do is they've got these beautiful pool of assets that they're growing and renting and investing in, but they're living in the place where they actually really want to live. One of them, you know, we're talking about someone earning $500,000 plus who has 2 fantastic investment properties, but wants to live right by the water. So they're renting by the water because they may want to move to somewhere else later down the track. without having all the entry and exit costs of having to buy a property as a home. And another couple who basically bought beautiful investment properties, but again, are living in an area where their kids are going to be going to school. And that's a temporary situation for them. So they're going to rent there so they can get their kids into that school catchment area and invest in the areas that are lucrative to them.
So that's a good point that you hit on, because it's about life goals. And so it's really, you might have kids that need to go to a certain school that you went to and your previous generations went to, and there's a bit of a legacy there. There might be a place that you need to live because you have elderly parents, you want to look after them. And so there's so many life decisions when you're buying property that you might not be able to buy in the same area as the parents, because often our parents come and they're in better areas, and really the children, because of affordability, just on the start of their journey, are pushed out. So you can effectively still be on the property ladder and still be able to rent near. But the reality is George also touched on, is if you have a high incomes, it's a way to be able to keep the tax efficiency of being able to acquire more and more properties whilst making the costs of strata, interest, or deductible into your strategy. But you have to talk to your accountant along with your advisor to make sure that that's at an even level where it's manageable, because you want to put a buffer in to say that just one financial downturn won't put you in a stress situation where you're forced to sell property. Because as we know with Daniela, there's stamp duty to pay, and that's a big chunk. And if you're in a situation where you're forced to sell a property, then all that hard work can go to waste.
It really is a big balance between lifestyle goals and financial goals. And I feel like I'm almost the perfect case study for this topic, because I live in an area, Sydney, where the median price point is about $2.5 million. Actually, a house across the road from me sold for $2.65 million at auction. Now, in my head, as I work that out, I think 20% deposit is just over $500,000. Then we got stamp duty of just over $100,000. So you need $600,000 just to get your foot in the door. And then I'm still left with a $2 million debt. Even if I'm paying interest only at 6%, we're talking $120,000 a year just in interest only payments. Then there's council rates, water rates, and property maintenance as well. Instead, I actually rent the property for around about $50,000 a year, and I don't pay to maintain the property. I don't pay council, don't pay stamp duty, nothing. Instead, I have a property portfolio behind me that actually pays for my rent. And so it's a perfect balance between lifestyle goals and investment or financial goals as well. Mike, coming back to a financial perspective, what are the differences in lending between a rentvestor and owner-occupier?
Well, just going back to the start of the topic, rentvesting is certainly not a trap, it's a strategy. And the dream scenario for me is that someone will come having had the discussion with George or with Andrew, have a clear strategy in mind and know what they're doing and why. And as George mentioned earlier, what rentvesting does is it gives you flexibility, because you can live where you want and buy where you can afford. It does come with some downsides, though. I mean, rentvesting means that your borrowing is going to be slightly more expensive. And in terms of what you can borrow for an owner-occupied property, you could, on a mortgage-insured loan, you'd be able to borrow up to, typically 95%, whereas for an investment property, you'd be capped at 90%. So there are some things to consider. Servicing is another one. If you're buying an owner-occupied property, then your income is going to be assessed at 100% of what your income is. Whereas if it's an investment property, then your rent income will likely be shaded, as banks do. They'll take it, they'll assess it at, say, 80%, sometimes 70%, but, it won't be all of what it is. So your borrowing capacity and servicing capacity are going to be impacted by those decisions that you make. So, yeah, look, rentvesting is just, it's a clever strategy if you want to buy, want to live where you want to live, and you want to buy a property that's going to benefit your long-term investment goals.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm thinking more around how rentvestors might be able to protect themselves a little bit better, especially as they start to accumulate property. Daniela, I wanted to ask, what other considerations do they need to take from a legality standpoint when they're starting to look at investing in property?
Well, I guess it comes down to the conversation that they will have, with George and Andrew. What's the entity they're buying under?
Yeah.
Are you going to buy as an individual? Are you going to buy it as joint, tenants, self-managed super fund, trust company? It comes down to that. The legal work, then it's the same. We just have to make sure that, they've had their conversation before that with the accountant, their financial planners, to make sure what's the best way for them, to purchase that property.
And I think that's very outcome driven as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because going back to your financial goals as well, you begin with the end in mind, and understanding what your exit plan will determine the entity ultimately.
Absolutely. I mean, George and we work together on these sorts of clients, and you really want to say, like with a business, if at some point, acquisition is one point that you consider, we always look at the exit strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends on whether you're still working, whether you sell, what the impact's there on the capital gains. Is it in a trust? How are you going to stream that? Or if you buy it in a company, right, then you lose those benefits around those CGT concessions. And so it's very important how you buy, how you choose to divert your cash. So it's something that needs to be, you need to sit down with your accountant, with your financial advisor, to make sure that it's going to make sense. And particularly the entity, whether you buy it instead of drawing the income from your business to yourself to buy it, or whether you leave it in your company, or whether you divert it and you put it in your trust. And so all these considerations are an extra layer of complexity that on top of just what property you buy, how you borrow it, and that it's the right legality in terms of your contracts are watertight. So going back to it, I would say make sure that you're, depending on the client, is that a client might be acquiring and they are so wealthy they never need to sell, right? And that's a very different position from someone who's, again, limited in their income, who, again, needs to buy, but they're buying because it's just a step. Eventually, they do want to settle down and buy that dream home. So it's to say, rent vesting can be a strategy that you take all the way through your life, or it can be a means to an end to accelerate your wealth generation to the point where you feel comfortable that you can buy that home that you're comfortable with.
I don't think you can undersell Danielle's contribution to this either, because the discussions that she has, like, she will actually call me at 8 o'clock at night. I've got this client doing this, and they've got it in this name, and they're doing it in this way. I don't think that it's appropriate for them. What do you think? And then she'll go back to them with some common sense approaches on how to do stuff, because it really makes a difference whether they go as joint tenants or tenants in common, or whether it should have been or shouldn't have been in a trust, and whether the names are correct for what's being done. That is just super important. And Daniela picks it up literally every time.
We've got to make sure before, when I get that sales advice, that I always tell the client, is that the right name? Have you talked to your accountant about that?
Yeah. A good conveyancer really is the last line of defense when it comes to purchasing a property, because once that contract is signed and it's unconditional, you're done.
Absolutely.
Supposedly they've done all their due diligence before they come to us, but we check.
Yeah. No, for sure.
So it's a funny perspective, because before when we bought property, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we often bought property in joint tenants because that's the way we did, and the culture was very different then. You married for life, and if we look at the divorce rates, they're 40% at the moment. The average divorcee is 42, and the average marriage lasts for 14 years, and suddenly you have all this property that potentially that you bought and held for so long, and there's no guarantee that when you divorce, your partner won't find another spouse. And you're saying, how do I protect that for my children? And it's to say, well, a good conversation with Daniela is to actually make that decision, is that maybe instead of having joint tenants where the person who owns the asset is the one who survives, maybe have tenants in common, where that value of the asset will be protected for the children going forward. And so even though you might have blended families going forward, you can still have those relationships, but also stay true to the money from the previous marriage passes on to that bloodline. And so I think Danny's conversations with my clients around those not only the name that goes on the contract, but how you buy it is so important.
Well, I think it goes back to even just that, what is the goal around purchasing the property, and even taking your estate planning in mind as well. So having somebody like Daniela to be that last line of defense, or have you considered whether to go tenants in common or tenants in estate is very important. What I'm seeing a lot lately is a lot of prospective clients coming to me saying, should I purchase through a trust? And I'm like, speak to your accountant. So, and there's this myth out
many podcasts out there
Oh.
promoting it.
Yeah. Yeah, this myth of unlimited borrowing through a trust is one that gets me all the time. But George, should rent investors buy in their own name, or what considerations do they need to take into account around the entity?
It's a really good question that I probably would get 2 to 3 times a week. It's everybody's circumstances is different. Whether they're going to be investing in a trust as individuals, through a superannuation fund, through a corporation, it really depends on what are their circumstances in this particular situation. Do they have a business? Do they have assets to protect? Are they in a risky occupation that requires them to have some more asset protection put in place? What are the considerations? Their family makeup. How wide is their family? Do they need to basically spread some of the load? Are they trying to assist children in buying, or starting their investment process through a trust? Like, there are so many different questions, and it's all very, I suppose, customizable depending on the circumstances. There are considerations though. If you're going to buy through a trust, one thing, especially in New South Wales, you've got to consider is this, land tax is you get land tax at $1.
Yeah.
So you don't get the exemption threshold as you would as an individual or as a company or as a super fund. But there are other advantages by doing that. And certainly through the ability to protect assets primarily and then be able to do discretionary distributions from that, depending on who is going to be getting what. And that then can fund in the medium to long term other things that the family is doing by that discretionary distribution.
Yeah, and that's important as well, because and then there's also maintenance costs associated. If you do decide to purchase through a trust, you're paying a lot more in land tax. You lose some tax, tax considerations as well. So that being said, it's really dependent on your goal, and I think the location is just as important as well where you're buying, because it goes back to what are your financial goals as well. So typically, rent investors, they rent vest because they're cash flow poor, or they have a lower barrier to entry where they can't buy in these higher medium price point capital cities as well. So that being said, you need to understand where the best place to invest is in, as well as what the most appropriate entity in, and that sort of couples in or ties in a lot with the financial planning goals as well. What is the purpose of you rent vesting? Is it because you want to get on the property ladder? Because there's a ton of assets out there that can do the same or similar job. It might be managed funds or shares, or how does the asset selection conversation go when you're talking to people around, what should they invest in?
I mean, the investing piece is the tactical. The strategic part of financial planning is, do I have, trust? If we go back to the trust, do I have a disabled child that I need to put money aside for? Am I expecting a large inheritance from my family? How broad the family is. Do I have a previous marriage? Do I need to protect some assets? Do I have a capacity to income stream? So it's either asset protection or income streaming. But then you say to yourself, okay, I've dealt with all of those broad issues of what we want to do and which country and where you want to be a tax resident. But when it comes to choosing an asset, the asset is purely about quality, right? Because if you're saying, I'm going to derive an income, and that income's going to replace the money I would have outlaid for a mortgage, right? And so that's what you're comparing. So you're comparing, my base case is, had I bought the property that I was going to live in, and this is what it costs to hold that property, for example, $50,000 or $80,000 a year. What if I took that money and that servicing capacity and I bought and I geared to be comparable, because it's gearing, a comparable investment. And so it's purely down to the quality of the asset, right? So you sit down with your advisor and you work out what you're comfortable with. And a lot of Australians are very comfortable with property, right? But, and I believe in property because, as a strategic advisor, everyone knows and should be comfortable. But there's a limit, right?
Yeah.
You don't just, I would never say that one asset class is the be all and end all. You want to spread your assets wisely. But let's face it, most people want to feel comfortable with one. They want one that they live in. And like you said, they might want to buy a unit for when they're they're older, that's close to where they want to retire, or one for their children if they're going to go to university and they're out of town. You might live in on a farm and you want to buy something in town, and so they're all considerations that the rent vesting allows you to do while still living in the place that you desire. And so, but back to your question about choosing the asset, it's got to have the affordability and you do the cash flow. It also needs to make sense to appreciate over time, because the return of asset is just not rental yield. It is the capital growth that you'll get, and you want to do a bit more research. You want to be supported by, demographics, population growth, industrialization in your area, because that's going to drive the property prices. The advantages of being further out is that when George is saying, I have clients that have done really well under that $1 million mark, because naturally people have that cash flow and affordability, and it brings up. And so we saw with COVID, when you no longer need to live in those big cities, you could move out and up and down the coast. That sea change and that city money just drove up property prices. But on the flip side to that is that if you do buy out there, that's for that generation. The next generation, will they be earning those city incomes? They might not be, and so that might be a false inflation. This is just a scenario, but to say why property in Sydney rises so quickly is the fact that if we're in a suburb and you have enclaves in Sydney, and for example, you might have like in Epping or Bellevue Hill or whatever it might, Bondi Junction, you want to be close to your community, right? And so you pay a bit more, and you'll get emotional, and that's another factor why people wouldn't necessarily buy in those areas, and that's actually a positive factor. So in many ways, the house that you live in, you might not be able to afford there, but you'll be able to buy example units there. I'm not telling people to go out and do that, but I'm just saying there's some considerations that you will say, oh, the asset might be a high quality asset that would appreciate over the course of decades. Why don't I get in now? Because that would appreciate far more quickly than had I just thrown everything at a property in Macquarie Fields, right? I'm not telling people to buy that.
I think the other aspect...
And it's an interesting point too. I mean, you can take all the logic you like, but some investors are the kind of people that want to be able to drive past the house and look at it and pat it and feel it, and others are quite dispassionate. They don't care if it's in Western Australia or far north Queensland. So, yeah, I mean, there are different motivations and different styles of borrowers around those kind of decisions.
Can I say something? What I'm seeing as well, I'm not sure if you're coming across that too. I've got clients who are selling all their properties, all their investments to buy their home.
Your dream home. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
I've just, one of my clients recently, they just sold
I've seen
5
that.
investment properties to buy their home.
Yeah, and that's often a strategy that people take. They use their investment portfolio to eventually get them into their dream home, whether it's through the income being able to service a loan or through the capital value as well. But I think one important aspect from a financial planning perspective that I just wanted to touch on briefly was their tolerance to risk, because we're using debt to invest in an asset, and that magnifies our exposure to the market. So we're increasing our exposure to the market, and a lot of people may not be comfortable with that. So that's one of their conversations that they need to have, is around their tolerance. Like, can they afford to increase their risk?
Yeah, that's a good point, Gianni. So, like in Australia, we've had such a good run with property as an asset class. And what we forget is property is a growth asset class. So regardless of whether it's managed fund shares or whatever it might be, an asset class has volatility. The only difference is property is not valued every day.
Yeah.
And so, or every hour, or every second. And then that's how we get really sensitive to fluctuations in volatility. But the reality is that what we do know as financial advisors, looking historically at returns, is that growth assets outperform cash assets. And so we're in a low cash environment where we saw the Reserve Bank last month drop interest rates by 25 basis points. They're forecasting another 4 rate cuts over the successive quarters. That cash is going to return you less. It will cause people to shift to growth assets to be able to protect the time value of their money and inflation. And that's really what it is. And so when you have a fall in asset value, you multiply that effect with gearing, right? And so is to say, is my time frame in your risk profile is to hold this asset so it return to value. There's no question that growth assets will return to where they are based off history. So it's just a matter of, am I solid in my income? Am I solid in my role? Is my business cash flow solid? And so these are the conversations I'll be having with the clients to say, are you happy? Because really, I'll before I start any of these conversations, it's a conversation of responsibility.
Yeah.
And so, in a day and age where it's so easy to have a Amazon Prime subscription, a Netflix subscription, everything's death by 1,000 cuts. You got your phone, you got your internet, you got so many subscriptions, but that's bad debt, right? You have the good debt, and I'm all for investing, right? Because it's good debt and the education around it, but it's only good if you can see the benefit at the end of the day. And so that means, sorry to talk so much, is to make sure that you can derive the benefit and see that capital growth come out over time. And so you have your exit plan to say, I'm going to exit at 10 years, I might exit at 20 years, I might exit at 30 years. But the most important thing is I can see through that, maybe that 8-year rocky period and see the benefits of why I've invested. And if you're a long-term investor, then definitely using gearing, it's very difficult to go wrong. It's only when you're forced to sell down, then you lose out on those costs that we spoke about, stamp duty, your deposits, LMI. It just doesn't make sense. The longer you leave it, the more it makes sense, but only if the asset is a good asset, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
A lot of golden nuggets in there. I'm sure we can talk about this topic all day, but we'll need to cut it there. So thanks everybody for joining us. So we'll catch you in the next episode.